This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest today is Saleh ElHattab, founder and CEO of industrial facility management software provider Gravity. Saleh is going to describe how Gravity's breakthrough software turns information from basic carbon accounting into a business advantage by using it to reduce industrial facilities' operating costs. Saleh began as a software engineer with business software provider Salesforce in 2015 and moved to top product management positions there and with Samsara before becoming a venture partner with Eclipse Ventures in 2021. He founded Gravity in 2022. So, Saleh, one of Gravity's key values is that the software begins with too often overlooked business realities. Let's go to the beginning and let's ask first, what is emissions accounting? Why is it done? And what does other carbon accounting software miss when it focuses industrial companies' efforts only on reducing emissions?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Herman. And happy to define that as well as kind of point to the market and how people have short-circuited something that has a lot of potential to it. Emissions measurement really is, at the end of the day, tracing the source of any emission, which is more often than not a kilowatt, a therm, a BTU, maybe it's a product on a ledger. And behind each one of these is a grid mix that translates it into carbon emissions or a carbon equivalent, like nitrogen and otherwise, that end up being contributors to an overall emissions footprint. The
Right.
exercise of emissions measurement is thus kind of going through your operations and identifying all those emissions generating activities, quantifying them, and then multiplying them by the most appropriate emission factor, which is basically a coefficient that translates that activity into real world carbon emissions impact.
And that's
So,
especially important. Sorry for interrupting,
no
Saleh, but
worries.
that's especially important in places where there are carbon markets, right? The EU, California, regional greenhouse gas emissions uh, group. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. In many markets where carbon is actually a cost that you pay a premium on if it's over a certain limit, there's tailwinds that cause people to mandatorily have to disclose and track this. I'll also say, even in the absence of those markets, it's something that is required for disclosure, even to large clients like the Amazons, the Walmarts, the Apples of the world, or even large automotives. So even if there isn't a tax effectively to those carbon emissions, a lot of people still have to measure and disclose on it. It's fairly ubiquitous for many companies, depending on their industry.
Okay. But I think I interrupted you from explaining uh, what other companies miss, carbon accounting companies or software miss when they focus only on reducing emissions.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, which is there's a reason why we position ourselves not only as a carbon management platform, but a carbon and energy management platform, because in plain English, carbon management really is that measurement exercise. It's the preparation of it for formal disclosure, and then it's ultimately getting it to whatever audience is meant to take it. And to many, that just sounds like a compliance chore. And transparently, there's a sea of offerings out there that leave it at just that, which is an exercise that is often quite labor intensive. And the kind of missed opportunity is, as I kind of called out, all those things, kilowatts, therms, products, they translate to dollars, not just emissions. And collecting them can actually become a heat seeking opportunity for inefficient spend within your organization. The good news is, unlike maybe carbon offsets, which are often premiums to business, so many of the pathways out of reducing your emissions, when you look at the core energy consumption, the products that you're procuring, are cost negative. And for us, we wanted to kind of bridge the gap. We wanted to make sure that while you're going through that labor intensive exercise, first, how do we make that less labor intensive? And we've invested so much in that data wrangling exercise becoming less of a pain and more of an opportunity. We don't just stop there. We actually identify proper noun projects that you can facilitate, and we go soup to nuts to actually facilitate those projects. We'll show up with an energy engineer. We'll do the HVAC optimization. We'll do a number of different projects and save you a dollar
Okay.
exercise.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to hold off on that particular because I think that's a really important feature of gravity. But I
Sure.
want to ask you a kind of a wonky question before, and we're going to get to that in detail, I hope, in a few minutes. But
Sure. Yeah.
I want to ask you a kind of a wonky question um, because it's really interesting. You turn the problem of carbon accounting from a cost for a company to a benefit for a company. And what I think is interesting is how did you, at a high level, what is it in the design? What did you sort of add to the programming or subtract from the programming? And this is a wonky question, so I urge you to try and simplify it and not spend too much time on it. But
No
just out of
worries.
curiosity, what was the programming or the structure of the program that allows you to lower costs while you're doing emissions accounting?
Sure. And forgive me if I stray too far from the question, but I love a wonky question. And actually, a lot of the thesis behind gravity is rooted in exactly this kind of crux, which is when I was looking at the market, actually, while I was at Eclipse and kind of evaluating existing vendors, um, one thing that really caught my eye was a report that effectively said there was $2 trillion annually in inefficient energy spent, right?
Mhm.
And I thought the carbon markets may be big, but it comes nowhere near that $2 trillion number. And so, at a minimum, the spend being put into the world of carbon reporting was significantly eclipsed by the opportunity that came from identifying inefficient energy spend. And so, what we wanted to do was kind of look into the Venn diagram of what are the inputs into identifying inefficient energy consumption and what are the inputs into identifying your emissions footprint. And the good news
Mhm.
was it was a fairly overlapping Venn diagram. So much of the data that you collect organically to actually generate a carbon footprint was a lot of the information that you needed to collect to understand opportunities you actually had at your disposal. What regions are you in? What's the grid mix? What's the cost of energy in that region, right? And how much do you consume per day? How much of that is on peak versus off peak? And maybe what's the solar exposure at your address? All these things we can actually derive from the basics of a utility bill. I have your on peak, your off peak, your address, and otherwise. And so if I'm collecting that gold information from you, what we wanted to do was keep an ontology of insights that could actually be cost reductive and project all that data through that ontology and elevate those insights in real time alongside the exercise. As an
Wow.
example, somebody might give us a utility bill or 12 of them, hopefully, for a full year's retrospect.
Right.
And we could just from that identify that there's a demand response program in your region, which means that the utility provider will actually pay you to consume less energy. We could find out that the consumption during those on peak times is a certain kilowatt budget. And so if we have all that, we can decide what kind of battery you would end up needing to deploy and the potential fiscal return you would get if you just shave that on peak consumption. All of that
That's a
just from the same data.
Yeah, that's a perfect bridge to my next question, Saleh.
I am leading you on. Yeah.
um, the what I want to do now is go from the wonky to the specific examples. I'm thinking, what kinds of companies have you worked with that where you've been able to reduce, industrial facility costs through this carbon, essentially carbon accounting program? Where have you streamlined heating and cooling system efficiency? Where have you taken advantage of those demand response program opportunities that you just mentioned? Or where have you maximized the use of on-site generation? Can you give me some examples?
Yeah. Yeah. We've been really spoiled to work with a plethora of different industries. And whether that's a massive contingency we have in manufacturing, a growing cohort in construction, all the way through to utility providers, we even work with CPG, consumer products, and otherwise. And that often invites, well, doesn't each shape of company have such a nuanced operation that solutions aren't applicable to any of them in a generalized way? And the good news is that's actually a false premise. There are so many solutions that are horizontally applicable. We all have heating and cooling. We all consume energy throughout 24 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours of a day in a way that things like HVAC optimization, which doesn't require a massive overhaul of your HVAC system, can be something we look into for everyone. Things like batteries are applicable to anybody who consumes energy and might want to use energy at cheaper times throughout the day. And so A couple of examples we're particularly proud on. We've already alluded to. We worked with a municipal utility provider in the Midwest, in Indiana, actually, and we were able to further condenser loop, which is a cooling system, find $2 million in annualized savings just from properly managing those, especially in the shoulder months where there's high swing between hot and cold between 2 days. I'm from Indiana. I'm wildly familiar with those days. I've seen my energy bill during those days. They're often horrific. But being able to do things like leverage variable frequency drives and actually have a central brain that manages those in mass, cognizant of those impending oscillations, yields so many savings. That solution we've deployed within non-ferric metal smelters. We've deployed it at office companies. And so that's just one that we find really ubiquitously advantageous.
What about on-site generation? When you take on your client and you look at their utility bill, or you must have some sort of screening, do you know, learn from them? Do you have solar, or do you have a solar suitable roof, or do you have some sort of a inverter system that could have, where you could have some on-site batteries, or do you have a heating and cooling system where you could uh, put in a smart thermostat? Do you go that far with your clients?
Absolutely. When we collect site information from our clients, many of the kind of initial questions we ask are, is this owned or leased? Are you the single tenant, or are you one of many on a multi-story building? Because these do end up being inputs into whether or not suggesting solar, suggesting batteries is actually going to be relevant to you. The good news is that the most energy intense, the ones who are manufacturers or large warehouses that cool products, typically are single tenants, typically have not only their entire roof, but sometimes massive lots around them that can be ripe for deploying solar projects on site. And so, yes, we definitely collect that information. And the people that stand to benefit from it the most are the ones that actually have the capacity to deploy it, because they do end up being in those places where opportunity to deploy is matched with the capacity to actually find a project solution provider.
Interesting. And the other advantage that you have is that most of those kinds of businesses have an individual who is particularly uh, tuned in to how much energy is costing that business. I mean, it's on their balance sheet in a way that small customers or residential customers aren't fully aware of what's going on, right? And so there's somebody you can work with, right?
Exactly. And often that person is the one who's been tasked with this new necessity to measure their footprint. And so
Uh,
I'll be honest with you, people are not always excited to meet us. It's because they've been told to do something they weren't expecting to do. And they definitely didn't go to school to do carbon footprinting or sustainability. Our aim is always to turn that person who is begrudgingly collaborating with us into a champion internally, because they found these incredible cost savings opportunities, and to become an evangelist of gravity. I will say, in 4 years, we've been very lucky to never have a single customer leave us, even though we've seen the kind of political and economic
yeah,
pendulum swing, and a large part of
right.
it because of this fiscal return that we continue to focus on.
Awesome. Well, I want to get to the question of what you've learned in those 4 years. But before I do that, I got to ask you one more question.
Please.
What about data centers? Could you work? Does industrial facility fall within uh, is it an umbrella term that would include data centers? We hear so much about data centers and how much electricity they're going to consume. Would they be a target customer for you guys?
Yeah, and really, the word industrial, whether industrial or infrastructural, it's a big tent, and a lot of people fall under it. We do have data center companies, and they do consume a lot of energy. One of them, Crusoe, is a great partner of ours. They also
Mm,
uniquely source energy by going to areas where sometimes gas is being flared and leveraging that waste energy rather than letting it go to waste. And so one, I love working with them because they're often building things from the ground up, which is the best opportunity to make energy efficiency decisions. And while it definitely is squeezing the grid in a meaningful way, a lot of these hyperscalers are the ones who set ambitious goals a decade ago and are the
right.
ones who are really invested in greenifying the grid. And so having them become significant contributors means that the kind of outlook for where we source this energy will hopefully be a little bit greener than if another player was the one that was spiking in energy consumption.
If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.